November was my month for reflection, to look at myself and think, why are there so many books on my currently reading list? Yeah, I started this month with 11 books that I was like in the middle of, and that was actually better than what it had been, which was 14. That was at its worst. So I decided that November would be just a focus on trying to clean that up. Of course, I still had TBR tackle to do. I did 2 different buddy reads, and I also decided that I wanted to join in on the World Cup readathon that Mark from Book Time with Elvis is doing. So there were some other books that I just decided to read that weren't from my currently reading list, but for the most part, or at least more than any other month, I did focus on trying to get that number down. So let's go ahead and see how well I did. Hi, my name is Sarah Freshly, and welcome back to Freshly Read Books. Also, I went to a baby shower earlier today, and we got temporary tattoos. That was a space-themed one. So that's what this is. So the first book that I finished in November was one that I had started in October. So it's not like I had been reading it for a really long time, and that is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. I no longer have my copy of the book because I have passed it along to a friend, as well as its sequel. Spoiler alert for another book we're going to be talking about in this video. Actually, maybe I'll just talk about both those two up front. So I read the first book in the series, as well as the second one, which is A Closed and Common Orbit, I think. That's the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers. So this is a sci-fi series that is not so focused on like a specific plot or action that's happening, but is more focused on the characters and like the world building aspect of it, but specifically like the intersocial communication of that world. This is a series that I am buddy reading with Sandy from Miss Reads a Lot, Gemma from Gem of Books, and Fraser from, oh my gosh, and Fraser from Springboard Thought. Also, because he insists on being in the video, this is Zuko looking much bigger probably since the last time he was shown on this channel. Anyways, the first book I really enjoyed. I loved meeting all these new characters and like these new species and how they work, how they communicate. It was all very interesting. It includes a long journey, which I love books about long journeys. So I did really enjoy it. There were parts of it that I thought really slowed down and that I didn't enjoy as much. The writing style in places wasn't great, but overall, I enjoyed the book. The second book took me a lot longer to get into. It follows kind of like tangential characters to who we know in the first book, so I wasn't like as interested in them initially. I was sad not to be like on with the same group that we were for the first book, but there was like 2 kind of storylines going on at the same time, and one of them I was really into pretty early on in that story, and then the other one I was kind of like meh about for almost the entire book until like it got to the end. I think I just need a little bit more plot, especially out of my sci-fi books. But I am looking forward to continuing in the series. I definitely enjoyed both books enough to continue reading. Also, the 4th book, I think it was nominated for the Hugo Award this year. And so like my curiosity for that book is great, high. I don't know. I feel like I started that sentence but didn't know where it was going. So after those 2 books, really, I was down to 10 books on my currently reading. Then I finished Venomous Lumpsucker by Ned Beauman. This was one that I had been reading for quite some time. Started it before Booker, the long list was announced. I thought that this could be on the long list. I wanted to read it, and I was really enjoying it when I was reading it before, but I just put it on hold because there was too much else to read. Then I was finally able to go back, and I ended up really, really liking this book. It's set in, I guess, like near-ish future where all of the animals are going extinct, but there are science labs that are taking the DNA from these animals so that they can kind of like recreate them later, but then that leads to more of like, well, if we've got the DNA, then like it's not such a big deal if we don't, like if a species dies out. And basically like if businesses want to do something that could impact the environment and possibly like a species could become endangered or even disappear altogether, then they need to get in like a nature expert that would look at the species and decide whether or not it's okay, I guess, that that species no longer exists. And a lot of that has to do with like the intelligence of the species and like determining that and stuff. So the Venomous Lumpsucker is the one that is being looked at the beginning of this book, but then it goes in like quite the direction, and it poses a lot of questions that different characters would answer in different ways. And it just, I think that there's a lot to think about, talk about with this one. I would highly recommend reading it. This was a fantastic book, possibly one of my favorites of the year. So with Venomous Lumpsucker, I was down to being in the middle of 9 books. So moving in the right direction. And then I continued to lower that number by reading finishing Women Without Shame by Sandra Cisneros, which is a collection of poems about the female body or about women in general, but like more specific to the author. And the title kind of pertains to not being like a shameless woman, but to being a woman without shame. And like it has that juxtaposition in, I think, the first poem. There's also, some of them are written both in Spanish and English, which I really enjoyed, especially as somebody that has studied Spanish for quite some time. I liked seeing how much I could get. Poetry is really hard because the words that are used aren't ones that come up like in conversation very often, but there was still some that I was able to pick up, which was like kind of a fun aspect of this book that I didn't expect to get going into it. But overall, I thought that the poems were great, and I don't read a lot of poetry, so it was really refreshing to do so. And also, poetry is so great because it packs such a punch for being typically very short. And so I really enjoyed my time reading this one. So with that, I was down to being in the middle of 8 books. However, my next book was one that I started during November and finished in November. That is The Troop by Nick Cutter. So I decided to join in on the World Cup readathon that Mark from Book Time with Elvis does, and my country was Canada. Basically what that means is you have to read a book from your country or about your country or that has some connection to your country. And then as you play through the group stage, if you lose to a team, then you have to read a book or something that's like connected to that country. So this was the book that I read for Canada. We had plenty of time between finding out what our country was and when the World Cup started that I could actually read like a full book for my country. But going forward, I think I'm gonna do like fairy tales maybe from the countries because I'm already behind and Canada lost every match. So sorry, Canada. And you should apologize to me too, honestly. I was excited to rep Canada, but also I knew very well that this could happen. Anyways, so I read The Troop, which is set in the Canadian wilderness on this little island where a troop of Boy Scouts goes, and there's this guy that like happens upon their campsite that is very hungry, I guess is a good way to put it. I'm reading the synopsis to see what is okay to say without spoiling anything. Okay, yeah, the intruder is shockingly thin, disturbingly pale, and voraciously hungry. This is a horror book, and it's horrifying. This book was tough for me to get through. There was a lot that just completely grossed me out that I had a really hard time and like struggled to get through. There was also a lot of just really uncomfortable moments or things that like I just didn't want to happen so bad, like just filled me with dread, so much so that like I physically felt ill, not even just like reading the disgusting things, like animal torture and things. So I understand like this is in the horror genre. I thought I could handle it. I mean, I guess I did. Like, I got through the entire book and everything, but I didn't enjoy myself very much at all. I don't think I'll be picking up another Nick Cutter book unless one is specifically recommended to me. Next, I finished Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders. This one I started, I want to say like February maybe of this year. So I'd been in the middle of it for a long time. This is quite an interesting book. I don't know that I loved it. I thought I was gonna love it just based off the premise and the way that it's told. And there are aspects of it that I love. I love it for existing in general, like, and being the way that it is, if that makes sense. But I just didn't connect with it as much as I was hoping to. This book is about Abraham Lincoln's son who passes away at 11 years old. And so it's like his journey or his experience, I guess, in the graveyard in this kind of like limbo state after death, but before reaching whatever else there could be. You know, might be a heaven thing or it might be something else, but he's in this like graveyard as a ghost and isn't quite one place or the other. So very neat. Glad that I have finally finished it. Then I read For Aunties and a Wedding, which is the second book after Dial A for Aunties. I also no longer have that book because I borrowed it from the library, so I had to return that. But I did a buddy read of this with one of my friends in my like in-person book club. And this was actually our second buddy read we've done together, the first one being the first book in this series. Basically, the first book in the series, our main character, Meddy, like accidentally kills somebody, but the whole book is her trying to like cover it up, and like she's got her family that's helping her out in this. Her family being the four aunts. It's silly, it's like kind of slapsticky, and overall it's just like a fun book. The second one I didn't like quite as much as the first one. The second one is during Meddy's wedding and like craziness happens. I won't say anything because I don't want to spoil anything, but it's very familiar. It feels very familiar to the first book. I think it does start to get like a little bit old, certain things, certain jokes about specific characters. Like there's a point when like an inside joke is just like referenced too many times, you know, like when you're referring back to something that was a little bit funny like earlier in the book, but when you refer back to it like another 5 times throughout the book, by the end of it, it's like, okay, it's not like that funny anymore. And that's kind of what it felt like in this book. So that was a book that I both started and finished in November, so that doesn't impact the number. However, I finished Kings of the Wyld, which I had been rereading for quite some time by Nicholas Eames. This is a book about a band of mercenaries that are retired, but they come back together for one last adventure. It is ridiculous. It's so much fun. The humor is great. I feel like humor in books is really hard to nail down. This book does it so well. But yeah, I had started a reread of this over a year ago, and I finally finished that reread, and now I can read Bloody Rose. Then I read The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. This is the book that won the National Book Award. It's about a bunch of people that are kind of connected through this apartment complex. It's called The Rabbit Hutch, but there's not much linking them together besides that. However, each of them has like a very unique story and a unique way that they are brought together. And overall, I think that it was just a fantastic book. I have a full review up on just this book on my channel, so I encourage you to check that out if you're at all interested in it, because I just gush about that for like 10 minutes or something. That was a book that I both started and ended in November, so it doesn't count towards taking down my currently reading total. And continuing on that theme, another book that I both started and finished in November is A Walk in the Woods. This was my TBR tackle book for November, and because of that, there is also a full video up on this book on my channel where I talk all about how I didn't really like it and it was very disappointing to me. But this is about Bill Bryson hiking the Appalachian Trail with a friend of his. He doesn't hike the entire thing, which is something that I didn't know going into the book and that I found very disappointing. I wish that it had been marketed a little bit differently. For me, it's not a huge deal that he didn't hike the entire thing, but the fact that he hiked less than half of it was something that really bugged me. And also it was a lot of like off and on hiking. Not to mention, I didn't really like Bill Bryson's personality through this. So yeah, overall, it was pretty disappointing. And then another library book that I've already returned to the library is Maybe in Another Life by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I've read quite a bit by Taylor Jenkins Reid at this point. My goal is to read all of her books and then film a video that talks about all of those, just like I have with Frederick Bachman and Ruth Ware. However, going back and reading the books that she wrote earlier in her career is a bit of a challenge for me because they are more romance leaning and I don't typically read or enjoy romance books, so that's a bit of a struggle. I liked this one at the beginning, and then I think that it just, maybe it's because I took so long to read it. This is another one that I was currently reading for a very long time, but basically it is about this woman who her life comes down to like this moment where she can decide one thing or another, and then the book plays out by showing what would have happened with each of those decisions through alternating chapters. And so it is kind of cool to like see her life play out, and also to see things happen in one timeline that would be true in either one, like something that she finds out in one timeline, which means that she will eventually find out that same thing in the other timeline because it exists like outside of her or had already existed before the split happens. So like that was kind of cool, like to play around with that. But I found the main character kind of annoying at some points, and also the amount of times that it is mentioned that she loves cinnamon rolls is insane. Like her entire personality is cinnamon rolls and like a high bun ponytail. That's who she is, and that's it. So I found that kind of frustrating after a while. During mine and Curtis's drive up to North Carolina, I started The Guide by Peter Heller, and then I finished it shortly after the trip was over, purely because I wanted to read a book that was like set in the mountains while I was going to the mountains, and it just felt right. And it had been a bit since I had just like picked up a book because I wanted to read it and just like started it right when I wanted to start it. You know what I mean? This book is about a man, Jack, who becomes a guide at this like fishing village, fishing resort in the mountains. This takes place in a world very similar to ours where COVID happened, but there's a lot more strains of it and they're more contagious, I would say, but it's very similar to like our current world. But this fishing resort has kind of become more popular because more wealthy people want to go there to get away from the pandemic and the threat of catching COVID. And Jack works as a guide at this fishing resort to basically pair up with whoever is visiting and then take them to the river and show them the best fishing spots, things like that. Teach them how to do certain things. So he's just started this job and he's gotten his first client, Allison, who is a celebrity in some form, but then they realize that like something else is going on at this resort and the book follows in that direction. So it's like a thriller book. I don't think that it is Crichton-esque, which I think, yeah, a Michael Crichton-esque thriller. I disagree. I don't think it is quite fast-paced enough to be considered like a Michael Crichton-esque book, but it was still a lot of fun, especially like towards the halfway point, I started getting really into it. It was really frustrating because while we were driving to North Carolina, like the sun's setting, and I was having a harder and harder time reading the words, but I didn't want to stop. I would say the one downside or the one complaint that I have about this book is just how much talk there was about fishing. It was a lot. Like, and it wasn't even something, I thought that maybe like once it got to the point where things were happening more, the talk of fishing would lessen. And I guess it did a little bit, but not much. So yeah, I definitely started skimming through those sections, pun intended. Anyways, that is going to do it for this video. So I feel like I did a pretty good job getting my currently reading down, and I've done well since then too. I've been working more on the books that I've been reading for quite some time. Let me know if you've read any of these books, how you felt about them, and also what your favorite book of November was. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, consider subscribing, liking, all that fun stuff. And I upload new videos every week, so I will see you then. Bye.